There is a particular kind of silence that only the desert knows. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that soothes a tired soul after a long day's ride. No. This is the silence that wraps itself around a person like a burial shroud. The kind that follows a woman into every room she enters. The kind that has a name even when nobody says it out loud. They called her Barren. And in the town of Sallow Creek, in the year of 1873, that single word was enough to make a woman disappear, not from the earth but from the world of the living. To be seated at the edge of every room. To be spoken about, never spoken to. To pour your own coffee and eat your meals alone while the whole town watches from the corners of their eyes. Clara Holt had endured 7 years of that silence. 7 years of sitting at the far end of the long table at May's diner, back to the wall, eyes to her plate, hands folded neat and still as a woman in a painting nobody wanted to hang. And then one Tuesday morning in October, dry, dusty, the kind of morning that crackles when you breathe, a stranger rode into Sallow Creek, tall, quiet, scarred in ways you couldn't always see. He walked into May's diner, looked around the room slowly, and then, of all the open seats, all the empty chairs, all the space in that crowded little room, he walked straight to Clara's table, set his hat on the wood, and asked, "May I sit with you?" What happened next would shake Sallow Creek to its foundation. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Sending love your way wherever you are. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Clara Holt was not born in Sallow Creek. She came to it as a bride, 19 years old, riding in a wagon beside a man named Edmund Holt who smelled of pipe tobacco and ambition. Edmund had inherited a modest piece of land 3 miles east of town. Dry, rocky land that even the cactus seemed reluctant to claim, and he intended to build something on it. A life, a legacy. Children to carry his name forward into the future like a torch passed from one generation to the next. The children never came. That first year, Clara and Edmund told themselves it was only time. They needed more of it, that was all. The second year, they prayed together on their knees on the rough wooden floor of their bedroom. Heads bowed, voices low. The third year, they stopped praying together and started praying alone. And by the fourth year, Edmund had stopped speaking of it entirely, which was somehow worse than anything he could have said. Sallow Creek was the kind of town where everybody knew your business before you knew it yourself. Word traveled through it the way water finds cracks in stone. Quietly, persistently, until it splits something open. By the time Clara and Edmund had been married 3 years, every woman in town had made her private calculation and arrived at the same public verdict. The trouble is with her. There was no trial, no evidence presented, no defense permitted, just the slow, steady removal of a woman from the social fabric of her community. One unturned chair at a time, one conversation that died the moment she approached, one church pew that somehow always managed to be full when she walked down the aisle looking for a place to sit. May's diner was the heart of Sallow Creek. If the town had a pulse, it beat in that narrow, warm, sawdust-floored room on the corner of Main and Copper Street. Every morning, the ranchers came in for their coffee and eggs. Every noon, the merchants and their wives crowded in for soup and bread. Every evening, the men who worked the mill sat at the long center table and argued about cattle prices and rainfall until May threw them out at closing time. Clara came every morning, precisely at 7. She would walk the 1.5 miles from the Holt property into town, her boots raising small clouds of pale dust with every step, her back straight, her expression arranged in the particular way a woman arranges her face when she has decided that dignity is the last thing they cannot take from her. She would sit at the table in the far corner, back to the wall, face to the room, and the room would quietly rearrange itself around her absence, the way a river bends around a stone. Not hostile, not cruel, just indifferent. The indifference was the cruelest part. Edmund died in the spring of 1871. A horse threw him. He hit the ground wrong and never got back up. Clara buried him on the property, beneath the one tree that grew there, a gnarled mesquite that looked like it too had been through things it didn't want to talk about. She was 26 years old. She kept the land. She kept her name. She kept her morning walks to May's diner, her corner table, her straight back and careful face. and the town of Sallow Creek kept its silence around her like a wall. What Clara did not know, what nobody in Sallow Creek knew, was that on the first day of October, 1873, a man named James Calloway had loaded his horse in a town 200 miles west and pointed himself east with no particular plan and a great deal of weight riding in the hollow behind his ribs. He was coming. He just didn't know yet what he was coming toward. James Calloway arrived in Sallow Creek on a Tuesday, which was, if you believed in such things, the most unremarkable day of the week. He rode a gray horse that moved with the careful, deliberate pace of an animal that had covered a great deal of ground and expected to cover a great deal more. The man on its back was somewhere in his mid-30s, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who had lived those years harder than most. He was broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with the kind of stillness about him that either meant he was very calm or very dangerous, and often it was both. He wore a plain coat the color of old leather, a hat that had been through rain and sun until it had achieved a certain character that new hats simply don't possess, and at his hip, visible to anyone who looked, a Colt revolver that had seen use. The kind of use that leaves scratches on the grip. He rode down Main Street at a pace that invited observation without welcoming it. The blacksmith watched from his doorway. Two women standing outside the general store paused their conversation. Sheriff Dale Purvis, a large, slow-moving man who wore his badge like a warning, tracked the stranger's progress from his chair on the jailhouse porch without getting up, which was itself a kind of statement. James Calloway rode to the livery, arranged his horse's care with a few quiet words and a few silver coins, pulled his saddlebags over his shoulder, and walked up the street until he reached the Sallow Creek Hotel, a two-story wooden building that leaned slightly to the left, as if the weight of all the tired men who'd slept in it had gradually pushed it in that direction. He rented a room for a week. The woman behind the desk, married to the hotel owner, sharp-eyed and quick with judgment, studied him the way a hawk studies something moving in the grass below. She registered the scar that ran along the left side of his jaw. She registered the absence of a ring on his left hand. She registered that he carried himself like a man running away from something, or possibly toward something, and that in her experience the distinction mattered enormously. "Business?" she asked, which was not a simple question in a town like Sallow Creek. It was an interrogation dressed in a single word. "Looking at land," he said. She wrote his name in the ledger. James Calloway. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a coin over in your hand, looking for something that tells you what it's worth. He thanked her, climbed the stairs, and put his bags down in a room that smelled of dust and old wood and something faintly like loneliness, which he supposed was appropriate. The next morning, he came down at 6:30, walked out into the pale, early light of a Sallow Creek October morning, and followed his nose to the only place in town where something smelled like food and warmth. May's Diner, on the corner of Main and Copper. He pushed open the door. The little bell above it rang. The room was already filling with the morning crowd. Ranchers, farmhands, a couple of merchants getting an early start. The noise was comfortable and layered. The clink of cups and low voices, and May herself moving between tables with a coffee pot held out like a weapon she was fully prepared to use. James Calloway stood in the doorway and looked at the room. He had the habit, developed over years of living in places where it mattered, of reading a room the way other men read trail signs, looking for what was where and why and what it meant. He saw the crowded center tables. He saw the clusters of familiar people in familiar seats, the social geography of a small town laid out as clear as a map. And he saw the woman in the far corner, sitting straight, alone, hands folded on the tabletop, a cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched yet, looking at nothing in particular with eyes that had decided long ago not to ask for anything. James Calloway picked up something from looking at her that most people in that room had long since stopped noticing. She wasn't simply sitting alone. She was enduring being alone. There was a difference, and he had spent enough of his own life enduring to recognize it in another person instantly. He walked across the room. He set his hat on the edge of her table. He looked at her directly, without the sideways avoidance that she had grown accustomed to, and he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that only she could hear, "May I sit with you?" Clara looked up at him. And for the first time in a very long time, someone in Sallow Creek looked back. May's diner had a memory. Not the written kind. The other kind, the kind that lives in the collective mind of a community that has eaten in the same room together for enough years that the room itself seems to hold a record of everything that has happened in it. The room remembered that Clara Holt always sat alone. So when a stranger, James Calloway, the new man from the hotel, the one Dottie at the front desk had already described to 4 separate people before breakfast, sat down at Clara's table and smiled at her with a directness that was somehow both respectful and warm, the entire room shifted. Not loudly, not with any drama that could be called out or confronted. Just a shift. The kind that moves through a room the way a change in wind direction moves through tall grass. You couldn't pinpoint the moment it happened. You could only notice, suddenly, that everything was leaning a different way. Conversations didn't stop. They simply quieted around the edges. Heads didn't turn completely. They angled just slightly, the way a man angles his ear towards something he wants to hear without wanting to be seen listening. May herself paused beside their table with her coffee pot and looked at the man with an expression that contained a dozen questions she was too smart to ask all at once. She poured his coffee. She refilled Clara's cup, the cup she noticed Clara had not yet touched, the way she often didn't touch it when she first sat down, as if the act of eating and drinking in that room required her to first survive the act of being in it. "Thank you," Clara said to May. Her voice was careful and precise, like a woman who had learned to make every word count because you never knew when someone would stop listening. James Calloway ordered eggs and bread. He asked May if she had preserves. May said she had plum and she had apple. He said plum sounded fine. May went away and the table was, for a moment, just 2 people sitting together in the morning light. Clara studied the man across from her. She was not a woman who trusted easily. 7 years of slow social execution had done its work on her. She had developed the particular survival skill of the chronically isolated, the ability to read a room and read a person and calculate, with precision, where the danger was likely to come from next. She looked at James Calloway and tried to find the angle. There was always an angle. A man didn't sit down with the town's discarded woman without wanting something. Pity, maybe. Information. A transaction of some kind. She had seen all the varieties of human cruelty that dressed itself up as kindness, and she was not going to be caught off guard by another one. "You're new," she said. A statement, not a question. "That obvious?" he said. "You sat down with me," she said simply. "That tells me you don't know yet." He looked at her steadily. He didn't pretend not to understand what she meant, which she found surprising. Most men would have fumbled through a performance of confusion. He just held her gaze and said, "Maybe I know more than you think." She said nothing to that. He ate his eggs. She drank her coffee. And the room around them buzzed with the particular energy of a community that had just watched something happen that it didn't have a category for yet. By noon, 3 separate conversations in Sallow Creek included some version of the question. What was that man doing sitting with Clara Holt? By evening, those conversations had acquired details they hadn't originally had. In the way of small towns, the simple act of sitting at a table together had become a story. And stories in places like Sallow Creek had weight. Hattie Morrison, whose husband owned the feed store, and who served as the town's primary social architect, arrived at the conclusion before sundown that James Calloway was either a fool or hiding something. The following morning, she was one of the first people in May's when the doors opened. She watched the clock. She watched the door. Clara came in at 7, as she always did. Back straight. Face arranged. She sat in her corner. She folded her hands. Hattie waited. The bell above the door rang at 7 minutes past 7. James Calloway walked in, moved across the room with that same calm, deliberate way of moving, set his hat on Clara's table and sat down. Hattie Morrison's jaw tightened. She didn't look away. She also didn't say anything, yet. But something in her eyes had changed, and anyone who had lived long enough in a small town to understand how the machinery of reputation and exclusion actually worked would have recognized that look. For exactly what it was. The beginning of a campaign. James Calloway had come to Sallow Creek looking at land. That part was true. But there were things about James Calloway that the hotel register, with only his name and his coins, had not been equipped to record. He had been a lawman once, a deputy in a silver mining town called Garnet, 200 miles west, in the time before the silver ran out and the town's reason for existing ran out with it. He had worn a badge for 4 years, and in those 4 years had done the kinds of things that badges require of the men who wear them, things that were necessary and things that haunted, and often both. At the same time, he had also been a husband. Her name was Nell. She was quick-laughing and direct and entirely without the social calculations that most people in small western towns developed like armor. She was the kind of woman who said exactly what she thought, which made her dangerous in a world that didn't always want to hear what it needed to. They had wanted children too. The children hadn't come for Nell and James either. And Garnet, smaller than Sallow Creek, meaner in its way, the way mining towns often were, built entirely around extraction and therefore prone to seeing everything in terms of what could be gotten from it. Garnet had made its verdict about Nell the same way Sallow Creek had made its verdict about Clara. The difference was that James had been there to see it happen, had watched the way a community can quietly dismantle a person, had watched the light change in Nell's eyes over the years. Not go out, exactly, but move inward, retreat to somewhere deeper and harder to reach, somewhere she went to protect it from the cold. Nell died in the spring of 1872. A fever took her in 4 days. She was 28 years old. James had ridden out of Garnet the week after the burial and hadn't stopped riding until he crossed some invisible line where the air felt different, less saturated with everything he was trying to leave. He didn't find that line. You never really do. But he kept riding anyway because moving was better than standing still. He came to Sallow Creek because a land agent he'd met in a roadside town had told him about a piece of property east of the settlement. Good bones, needed work, priced below what it was worth because the previous owner had died without heirs and the bank was eager to move it off the books. He hadn't come for Clara Holt, but he'd sat down at her table because he recognized her. Not her face, her posture. The way she occupied space, the way someone who has been told they don't deserve space occupies it. Precisely, carefully, taking up exactly as little as possible so as not to attract the consequences that come from taking up too much. He knew that posture in his bones because he had watched Nell develop it over 4 years in Garnet, and he had not understood what he was watching until it was too late to do anything about it. He was not going to make that mistake twice. So he sat down, not out of pity, not out of agenda, out of the particular understanding that comes from having lived beside someone who endured what Clara was enduring, and knowing in a way that lived in the chest rather than the mind, that the worst thing you can do for a person in that situation is nothing. Clara didn't know any of this. Not yet. What she knew was that he came back every morning. Same time, same table. Sat down without asking again after the first day because the first day she hadn't said no, and somewhere in the logic of that she seemed to have made a decision. They talked. Slowly, carefully, the way two people who have both learned to be careful with words talk to each other. He asked her about the land she kept, the rocky 3 miles east of town. She told him about it with the pride of someone who has maintained a thing through sheer will. He told her he was looking at land himself. She asked him which piece. He described it, the bank property, flat and dry, about a mile from her own. Her eyes sharpened slightly. She knew that property, had watched it sit empty for 2 years. You'd have your work cut out, she said. I know how to work, he said. She looked at him in that calculating way she had, looking for the weakness in the structure, the place where the thing collapses. She didn't find it, not that day, and that, more than anything else, more than the kindness of the gesture, more than the directness of his gaze, was what she couldn't stop thinking about on the 1.5-mile walk home. 3 mornings later, Hattie Morrison appeared at the table. She stood beside it with a cup of coffee in her hand and her chin at a particular angle that meant she had prepared what she was about to say and intended it to land. She looked at James Calloway and said, with a smile that had no warmth in it, I hope you've been properly introduced. Clara Holt is something of a fixture in this town. We all look after her. The pause after the word fixture was precise. James Calloway looked up at her. His face didn't change. His voice, when he spoke, was entirely even. "That's generous," he said. "Though I've noticed she generally looks after herself." Hattie's smile flickered. She walked away. Clara stared at her coffee cup. Her hands, folded on the table, were very still. "You don't know what you've done," she said quietly. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I know exactly what I've done." Hattie Morrison moved the way water moves in a dry land. Quietly, persistently, finding every crack and working it open. Within a week of the morning at Mays, Sallow Creek's awareness of James Calloway and Clara Holt had been carefully cultivated from simple curiosity into something with edges. Conversations happened in the general store, in the churchyard after Sunday service, on porches in the cool evening air, that carried within them the particular coded language of small-town social warfare, questions that weren't questions, concerns that weren't concerns, observations that were really verdicts. "Doesn't he know about her situation? Someone ought to tell him. It's only right. A man looking for land and legacy doesn't want to tie himself to a woman who can't." The sentences were rarely finished. They didn't need to be. The unfinished sentence was the whole point. James Calloway went ahead and bought the land. The deed transferred on a Friday morning. He signed the papers in the bank, shook hands with the bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Pruitt who seemed constitutionally uncomfortable with silence, and walked out onto Main Street owning 52 acres of dry, flat earth that hadn't been worked in 2 years. He started working it the following Monday. Clara watched from her property, her higher ground, her rocky eastern acres, as 3 miles away, a gray horse moved back and forth across the land below, pulling a mended plow through ground that had forgotten what it was to be asked for something. She told herself she was just watching the land, not the man. She half believed herself. On Thursday of that week, she rode down to the property line where her land met the flat land that was now his and found him there at midday, eating bread and dried meat in the shadow of a fence post, hat off, face lifted toward the October sun like a man trying to remember what warmth felt like. He heard her horse and opened his eyes. "Hungry?" she said, because she had brought more than she needed, which she told herself was a coincidence. He took the offered biscuit with a nod. They sat at the fence line without ceremony. He told her then some of it, not all. Not Nell's name, not the shape of the grief that was still fresh enough to cut, but Garnet, the badge, the years of hard decisions, the long ride east. She listened. She was a good listener. The people who are made to be quiet for long enough always are. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about Edmund, the marriage, the hope that came with it, and the slow, particular devastation of watching hope become something else. She told him about the tree on her property, the mesquite where she'd buried him, and how she sometimes went and sat beneath it. Not out of grief exactly, or not only grief, but because it was the one place on her land where something had happened that the land had witnessed and held. They sat at the fence line until the sun started its drop toward the horizon and the light turned that particular shade of amber gold that the desert does in October, reluctant and gorgeous and brief. Then Sheriff Dale Purvis rode up. He was a big, slow-moving presence on a big, slow-moving horse, and he approached with the deliberate ease of a man who wants to make sure you see him coming. He stopped at the fence line, looked at both of them with eyes that had been doing the town's unofficial social policing for 15 years. "Calloway," he said. "Getting settled in, I see." "Working on it," James said. Nothing in his face. Nothing in his voice. "Folks in town have some questions," Purvis said. "About your intentions." "Which folks?" James asked. Purvis didn't answer that. Instead, his gaze moved to Clara with an expression that wasn't cruel. He wasn't a cruel man, exactly, but that contained within it the full weight of 7 years of community consensus about what she was and wasn't, what she deserved and didn't. "Clara," he said, nodding at her. Then back to James. "Just wanted to say that Sallow Creek is a town that takes care of its own. People here have long memories." He turned his horse and rode back toward town. A long silence sat between them after that. "He means it as a warning," Clara said. "I know," James said. "To you," she said. Not to me. He's warning you away. I know, he said again. She looked at him sharply. And he picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd set it, turned it in his hands slowly. Long memories are only useful, he said, if they're remembering the right things. Clara's throat tightened in a way she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. She rode home before the light ran out, and she sat at her kitchen table for a long time afterward in the dark, not lighting the lamp, just sitting in the particular way of a person who is trying to understand something that doesn't yet have a shape she can hold. Above her fireplace, on a wooden shelf, sat the one thing she had never let go of in 7 years. A small, folded piece of paper. A letter she had written to herself in the 2nd year of her marriage, in a moment of private desperation, that she had never sent and never destroyed. It said only, "I am not what they say I am." She hadn't looked at it in years. That night she did. November came to Sallow Creek cold and iron gray. The October amber drained out of the sky like color from an old photograph, and what replaced it was the hard, flat light of early winter, the kind that makes the desert look like something carved rather than something grown. The kind that strips away all the warmth and shows you the bare structure of things. It was in this light that everything came to its point. It had been 6 weeks since James Calloway rode into town. 6 weeks of morning tables and fence-line conversations and careful, accumulating trust built the way you build anything in dry country. Slowly, against resistance, with a willingness to keep going even when the ground fights you. Hattie Morrison had been building something too. She had been working the community the way she knew how to work it, through the invisible channels of reputation and social pressure, through the particular power of a woman in a small western town who understands that influence doesn't require a weapon or a badge, only patience and access to the right conversations at the right moments. She had spoken with Pruitt at the bank, had spoken with the Reverend's wife, had spoken with 3 of the 4 ranching families who held the most social weight in the county surrounding Sallow Creek. And what she had woven together from those conversations was a version of James Calloway that had no basis in fact but every advantage of plausibility. A drifter, a man with unclear history, possibly running from something in his past, entangling himself with the town's most pitiable figure for reasons that could not possibly be innocent. She delivered this to Sheriff Purvis on a Wednesday morning with the efficiency of a woman who has done her homework and knows it. Purvis went to James Calloway's property that same afternoon. James was working the fence line on the western edge of his land when he heard the horse. He straightened, set down his tools, and watched the sheriff approach with the particular attention of a man who has spent enough years on the other side of a badge to read what a visit means. Purvis dismounted. He was carrying papers. "Got a communication," Purvis said. "From a Sheriff Aldridge. Garnet." James said nothing. His face went to that stillness that was either very calm or very dangerous. "Says there was some trouble in Garnet before you left. A man died. A man was shot trying to burn down a family's home," James said quietly. "I was the deputy who stopped him. There was an inquest. I was cleared. Aldridge tells it different. Aldridge is the man who gave the order to look the other way. He had reasons to tell it different." Purvis studied him. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a true one." A beat of silence. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like a slow exhale. "I'll need to look into this," Purvis said. "Until I do, I'm asking you to stay in town limits." He remounted and rode away. James stood at his fence line for a long time after that. He had known, in the back of the place where you know things you'd rather not, that Garnet would follow him. That Aldridge, who had built a comfortable arrangement with the men who ran Garnet's darker industries, would not simply allow a man who knew what James knew to ride off cleanly into the distance. It had only been a matter of time. He had not expected Sallow Creek's own machinery to be the thing that handed Aldridge the opening. That evening, Clara came to him. She had heard, because in Sallow Creek you always heard, and she had walked the 3 miles from her property to his in the evening cold, coat pulled tight, face carrying an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not concern. Something fiercer than that. "Tell me," she said, when he opened the door of the rough cabin he'd been sleeping in and working out of since buying the land. He told her. All of it. Garnet. Nell. The badge. The man who died. A hired enforcer who'd come in the night with torches to burn out a family who'd refused to sell their claim to the men who wanted it. The shot James had fired. The inquest that cleared him, and the way Aldridge had made the air in Garnet impossible to breathe afterward, until leaving was the only logical choice. He told her about Nell too. Her name this time. The fever. The 4 days that erased 4 years of marriage with a brutality that didn't care about fairness. When he finished, the cabin was very quiet. Clara sat across the small table from him in the lamplight, her hands folded in front of her in that particular way she had, the way that started as armor and was slowly becoming something else. "Why didn't you leave?" she said. "When Purvis came with those papers, you could have ridden out." He looked at her. "Because I'm done riding away from things that matter," he said. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved against the cabin walls with that dry, insistent November sound. Not hostile, just relentless. The desert talking to itself. "Hattie Morrison did this," Clara said. "Not a question." "She was the instrument," James said. "Aldridge is the cause. What will you do?" He leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "I have documentation," he said. "Records from the inquest. A letter from the family whose home I saved, signed and witnessed. I kept them. I kept them because I knew someday I might need them." He paused. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to walk into Purvis's office and put them on his desk. And then I'm going to sit there while he reads them." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I'll come with you," she said. He started to say she didn't need to do that. She stopped him with a look. "I have sat alone in this town for 7 years," she said. "I am done sitting alone." They walked into Sallow Creek the next morning together. Side by side, on the main road, in the pale iron-gray November light, moving at the same pace, generating between them a kind of quiet that was the opposite of the silence that had followed Clara for 7 years. This silence had weight and choice in it. This silence said something. May's diner went still when they passed the window. Hattie Morrison saw them from the doorway of the general store. Her face did something complicated. They walked into Purvis's office. James laid the documents on the desk. Purvis read them, took his time, read them twice. When he looked up, his face carried the expression of a man who has been given information that requires him to rearrange what he thought he knew. "This clears you," Purvis said finally. "I'll communicate back to Aldridge accordingly." "I'd appreciate that," James said. Purvis looked at both of them. Something moved in his expression, not quite an apology, because men like Purvis didn't often arrive at apologies easily, but something adjacent to one. Something that acknowledged, without saying it, that the town had done something to this woman over many years that he had been party to by silence. He nodded at Clara. A small nod, but real. They walked back out into the morning together. The winter of 1873 settled over Sallow Creek like a long, considered breath. James Calloway worked his land through November and into December, and Clara Holt was often at the fence line when he paused to rest. Sometimes bringing food, sometimes bringing only herself, which was enough. They did not rush what was growing between them. They had both been in places where rushing had cost something irreplaceable, and they were old enough in their bones to understand that the things worth having are worth building slowly, on ground you've tested first. What changed in Sallow Creek was not dramatic. It didn't happen in a single moment that could be pointed to afterward. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually, through the accumulation of small decisions by ordinary people who were presented with new information and chose, quietly, to let it matter. May started saving Clara's preferred table. Not the corner one, but a better one, nearer the window. The sunlight hit it in the morning. The Reverend's wife spoke to Clara after Sunday service, genuinely, for the first time in 4 years. Even Hattie Morrison, in the particular way of people who understand that a story has changed and choose to acknowledge it rather than be buried by their own resistance to it, offered Clara a nod one afternoon on the street that contained within it something very close to acknowledgement. Not forgiveness requested, not forgiveness given, just acknowledgement. Just the very first small step of a town beginning to understand that the story it had told about a woman for 7 years was a story it had made up. And that made-up stories, no matter how long you tell them, don't become true. Clara Holt never stopped walking straight. She never stopped sitting with her back to the wall, because some habits are earned through hard years and don't need to be surrendered. But she stopped being alone in the room. And James Calloway, the man who'd ridden away from one town carrying everything that Garnet had given him, the grief and the guilt and the long exhaustion of doing the right thing in a world that punishes you for it, stopped at the fence line, built a gate in it, started coming through. On the last day of December, the final day of 1873, James Calloway knocked on Clara Holt's door with his hat in his hands and a question in his eyes that was not about land or legality or the town's opinion of anything at all. What he said, she kept to herself. What she answered, the desert heard and kept. What the town of Sallow Creek understood, over time, in the slow way of places that have long memories and, occasionally, the grace to make new ones, was that a barren woman and a broken man had found in each other something that had no name in the ledger books of social verdict or community approval. Something that didn't require anyone's permission to be real. The mesquite tree on Clara's property, the gnarled, weathered tree that had seen a burial and a grief and 7 hard years of a woman keeping herself together by will alone, put out 3 new branches in the spring of 1874. Nothing dramatic. Just 3 small, green, stubborn branches reaching upward from old wood. The desert noticed. What would you have done, sitting in that corner, when someone finally looked at you and asked to sit down? If the story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And stay until the next one, because the West has more stories to tell, and we're just getting started.